Hello and welcome to the fourth lecture of the fifth and final week of the Open University's MOOC on Genocide. In the last two lectures of our short course, both today and in the next lecture later this week, we will briefly examine an interesting and extremely appalling case study, the annihilation of the native population of North America, or rather the Native Americans who lived in the territory of the United States. Today I will give you the background to this story. I will talk a little about the Native American population and a little about the British conquest of North America, the establishment of the United States, and about the clash between the two civilizations, the European civilization, English in origin, and the Native American civilization of North America. In the next and final lecture of our course, we'll talk about the annihilation and examine whether any of it was deliberate and whether this case constitutes genocide. We will also try to draw conclusions about this story. Research estimates that in 1776, the number of Native Americans living in the territories of the United States will eventually spread to was 6 million to 10 million people in this vast area between the east and west coasts of modern United States. An 1890 census held in the US counted all the Native Americans who were already enclosed in reservations, and the total number reached 250,000 people. We do not know whether 6 or 10 million Native Americans lived in this vast area in 1776 when the United States was founded, but even if we take any average estimate from various researchers, we still have to wonder where all those people disappeared. How does a population of 6 to 10 million people diminish to only 250,000? We do not have conclusive answers to that question, nor do we have any hard evidence for the act of genocide in the 19th century. And yet, today and in the next lecture, I'll present data that sheds some light on this painful and interesting story. When talking about Native Americans in North America, we're not talking about one people. We are talking about over 70 different nations or tribes. The Native Americans themselves today prefer to be identified by nation, with over 70 different spoken languages, all of which, without exception, were oral languages, that is, strictly spoken languages. The majority of these natives lived as traditional nomadic nations and tribes migrating from place to place, though some lived in permanent settlements. Some nations did farming and established real communities. Either way, there is no unity among the native population, and in many cases, we see bitter and bloody rivalries and wars between different nations. Perhaps this may help us when we examine why the Native Americans did not actually resist, or were not able to resist the spread of the US to the West from its establishment in 1776 and on throughout the 19th century. The English began to settle the eastern coast of North America in 1608 with the first English colony, Virginia. This was the very first colony, which also became the largest and most powerful and richest of the 13 colonies established until 1776. These 13 colonies decided to rebel against the parent country, the UK, and on July 4, 1776, published the famous Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson, a young 33 years old at the time, who will later serve as the third President of the United States from 1800 to 1808. Between 1608 and 1776, the English colonies lived in relative peace with the Native American nations around them. This primarily because the British government ensured industrial peace with the natives. During the early settlement, there were several cases of violence where the natives killed entire populations of colonies. The British learned their lesson and realized they can't challenge the Native Americans too much, so they made several agreements with a host of neighboring Native American nations under which they would not expand westward in their direction, and then proceeded to maintain trade relations that the natives could ultimately accept. This story changes dramatically as soon as the United States declares independence and breaks away from British rule. These new Americans, who up until the day before the Declaration of Independence were English subjects, talked among themselves in the elite political forums. We still have the protocols today and can read their own words and realize that one of the main issues facing the leadership of the rebel colonies was the conquest of all of North America. That is, from the outset in 1776, it is clear that one of the main goals of these 30 new states is to take over a huge area, much larger than their territory at the time. In our context, the relevant issue is the fact that millions of Native Americans were living in that territory. This topic troubled US leaders in the first years following its establishment, and in the beginning we see two different approaches among United States political leadership on the Native American question. One prominent approach in the first decades of the United States talks about civilizing the Native Americans, if you will, and eventually integrating them into US society as equals in all respects. This provided that the natives agreed to give up the vast territories they own and move into residence typical of the average American farmer, a small farmhouse with a relatively small plot, and become part of the fabric of the United States as it formed in its early years. This approach, most famously promoted by the author of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, was trumped by another approach which became dominant, especially after 1830. This approach considers the Native Americans as nuisance and seeks to differentiate the white population of the United States from the Native American population. This racist approach considers the Native Americans inferior and claims they can never really fit into the social fabric white America seeks to build. In 1828, a new United States president takes office. Andrew Jackson, hero of the war between the United States and England between 1812 and 1815, in which the British recruited Native Americans to fight alongside them against the United States. Andrew Jackson, who was a senior military officer in the war, killed quite a few Native Americans with his own hands and developed a hatred towards them in the course of that war. He was elected president in 1828, and this hatred became one of the main aspects that will characterize his two terms until 1836. Indeed, in 1830, the US Congress, under President Jackson, enacted a law with a sexy name, the Indian Removal Act, under which tens of thousands of Native Americans were transferred out west, thus clearing the majority of the United States at the time from Native American presence. This approach becomes more dominant in the following years and culminates when the American Civil War breaks out in 1861. In the next lecture, we'll talk about the events of that war, which ended in 1865, in which many Native Americans take part, both on their own initiative and against their will. We'll also talk about what happened after the Civil War in a series of battles known as the Plains Wars, in which the US military effectively clears most of the United States from the presence of Native Americans. In the meantime, thank you and goodbye.